They called her a tribute girl, a debt paid in warm flesh, a placeholder queen for a king who needed only the appearance of one. The foreign lords laughed about it in their camps, their breath fogging the winter air of a kingdom that had never once looked at her and seen anything worth keeping. She was 40 silver weights. She was a name on a ledger. She was nothing. By the last battle, a king would bend his knee to her in front of every lord who had laughed. This is how it happened. The year was 1114 of the Iron Accord, and the night of sealed fires had come early to the mountain keep of the Ashfang throne, the cold arriving not in stages but all at once, as if the sky had made a decision. Ice had formed along the inner ledges of the high windows. The courtyard torches burned without movement in the still air, their reflections locked in frozen puddles underfoot, and the stone halls of the keep smelled of pine resin and wood smoke and the particular sharpness of a court on its last margin of options. Mira Ashvale had arrived at the keep 3 days before the ceremony, carried in a covered cart with 2 cloaks to her name and a single small bundle containing her mother's folded herbalist notes. She was 22 years old. She was the daughter of a healer who had died in debt, and that debt, 40 silver weights owed to a northern tribute broker named Karath, had been settled by signing her name to a service contract she had not been permitted to read in full before the ink dried. She had read the portion they showed her. It said she was to present as the Alpha King's consort for the duration of treaty negotiations, until the war's formal close or the accord's dissolution, whichever came first. It did not say anything about being returned. She was not naive about what that meant. She simply had not yet found the edge of what it would cost her. The woman who met her at the cart step was named Senna, a broad-shouldered seamstress of perhaps 50 years, with a face that gave nothing away, and hands that were already assessing the cut of Mira's cloak before introductions were finished. Senna said only that the queen's chambers were 2 flights up, that the gowns had been fitted from Karath's measurements and would need adjustment, and that there were things Mira would need to know about this keep before the morning ceremony. She said the last part as a fact, not an offer, and she walked back inside without waiting, so Mira picked up her bundle and followed. There was food on the table in the chamber, a bowl of grain porridge with a cloth over it to hold the warmth, a heel of dark bread, a small jar of dried yarrow that Senna had left without comment. Mira ate, and then she sat by the window in the cold, looking out at the torchlit courtyard below, and she pressed the 40 silver weights to their place in her memory where they would sit until she had paid them back. In some form she had not yet imagined. She did not sleep well. The morning was gray and absolute. Senna arrived before light, dressed her in a gown of dark green wool trimmed at the cuffs and collar with a band of silver thread, and pinned a thin circlet of hammered iron at Mira's temples. She worked without ceremony and with a kind of brisk authority that made the act feel practical rather than theatrical, which was the only way Mira could have stood it. When the work was done, Senna stepped back and looked at her for a moment. "You will not curtsy to the foreign alphas," Senna said. "A queen does not curtsy. You lower your chin. Precisely this much." She demonstrated. "You keep your hands still. If he speaks to you, you answer. If you are uncertain what to answer, you say nothing and look at the wall behind their heads. They will assume it is dignity." Mira looked at her. "Have you done this before?" Senna reached out and pressed one of the circlet's pins more firmly into place. "I have dressed 3 women for ceremonies in this keep. 2 of them survived the court. Eat the rest of that bread before we go down. If you have found this story and you are watching closely, consider leaving a comment below. The story that follows rewards attention to what happens in the treaty hall, because nothing in it is accidental. The great hall of the Ashfang throne held 4 dozen men that morning, gathered under banners Mira did not know and could not read in the low winter light. They were ranked along the long tables by some ordering principle she had not been told, And at the far end, on a raised stone dais, stood the War Council's table, and behind it, the throne. And in front of the throne, not yet seated, was Kale Shadowfang. She had expected something obvious. She had composed herself against the specific performance of power she had seen in tribute brokers and minor lords, the practiced weight in the stance, the cultivated contempt in the gaze, the cold designed to announce itself. What she found was different. He was tall, and the war coat he wore was dark, and his face was unornamented and still in a way that was not calculated, but simply present, as though the room's noise stopped when it reached him out of its own accord. He was watching the room with eyes that were cataloging rather than performing. He did not look at her when she entered. The foreign alphas did. They were seated along the left table, 5 of them under banners from territories east of the mountain passes, and the one nearest the dais, a heavy man with a jaw like a mason's block, turned and looked at Mira the way a man looks at a contract he has not yet signed because he suspects the other party's terms are inflated. He did not bother to lower his voice when he leaned to his neighbor. "Korath's tribute girl," he said. "The king buys his queens from ledger brokers now." The hall did not silence. The words reached perhaps a dozen men. Mira kept walking toward the dais with her chin at exactly the angle Senna had demonstrated, and she kept her hands still, and she fixed her gaze at a point on the stone wall above the foreign alpha's head, and she felt his assessment land on her like something physical, a cold pressure across her shoulders that she did not permit herself to acknowledge. She reached the dais. Kyle had turned to watch her cross the last 20 feet of the hall, and she could not read what was in his face, because she had not yet learned how to read him, but she did not look away from him because looking away would have cost her something she could not afford. She stopped beside him. The ceremony called for her to be presented at his left hand, and so she stood there, and the court scribe read the compact's terms in a loud, flat voice, and at the passage that named her as the Alpha King's consort for the war's duration, the mason-jawed Alpha made a small sound of derision that Mira heard clearly. Then Kale spoke for the first time. "Lord Voss." His voice was low and without particular color. "You have spoken twice without recognition from this table. The third time will be remembered in the council's record." The hall shifted. "Lord Edric Voss." She noted the name in the way she noted herb concentrations and weather changes, as something that mattered and would continue to matter, settled back against his seat. He was smiling, but the smile had recalibrated. The scribe continued. At the clause requiring the consort to place her hand on the accord stone, Kale's hand was already there, palm up on the cold surface, and she set hers into it because the ceremony required it, and the moment her hand rested in his, she felt something she had no honest word for. It was warmth, which made no sense given the stone and the cold hall and the temperature of the morning. It moved from the contact point up through her wrist and settled somewhere below her collarbone, a warmth with a quality of recognition in it, as if something inside her had been waiting at a door for a long time and heard, finally, a familiar tread on the steps. She told herself it was the hall's hearth, catching a draft. She told herself the hall's hearth was behind her, and no draft from it would reach her hand. Kale did not release her hand when the clause finished. He held it one full breath longer than the rite required, and in that extra breath, she felt him look at her, and she did not look back. The treaty was witnessed and signed. The hall's noise resumed. Mira stood at the dais with her hands still at her sides and thought about Ironvale ash, which she had handled once in her mother's workroom, which her mother had warned her never to touch with bare skin, because 3 drawn breaths of its dust were enough to stop a wolf's lungs entirely. She thought about it because it was the kind of specific, dangerous knowledge that steadied her when she needed steadying, and she needed steadying now. The days that followed were a kind of siege by proximity. The Queen's role required her presence at meals, at council briefings she was not supposed to fully understand, at the 2 evening receptions the War Council held for the foreign delegations. She attended all of these things in Senna's fitted gowns with her chin at the correct angle. And she learned the keep. She learned that Davin, Kale's war captain, a man of perhaps 40 with a scar that crossed his left jaw from ear to chin, was skeptical of her in the particular way of a man who is loyal to something he is afraid of losing. He did not disrespect her openly. He positioned himself instead at angles that meant she was always slightly aware of being watched and assessed. And he spoke about her in the third person when she was present in a room, as if she were a variable in an equation he was still solving. She learned that Senna came to her chamber every morning with the yarrow replenished and with information she had gathered from the other servants. Small structural facts about who trusted whom in the court and what the War Council had argued about the night before, delivered in the same practical tone as the gown fittings. She learned that Kale rose before the keep's bells and walked the battlements alone in the cold, that he ate without conversation, that he asked questions rather than issuing orders in his smaller councils, and that the men who served him feared his silence more than any raised voice. She had not yet spoken to him alone. The guard appeared at her door on the 4th morning, a young wolf in ashfang armor who had clearly been told only that he was assigned to the Queen's corridor. He did not know what to do when she opened the door herself, clearly expecting a chambermaid to have done it, and he fumbled through an explanation. Kale had issued the standing guard order without explanation to the council. She learned from Senna that afternoon. The council had not asked him for one. The question she could not put down was why. On the 8th day, Voss's second-in-command arrived at the keep to renegotiate a clause in the side agreement. A man named Aldrich, who wore his contempt in a different register than his lord, more offhand, more accidental. He referred to Mira in Kale's presence at the reception table as the tribute. He said it the way one says the word weather, a plain noun applied to a plain thing. Kale set his cup down. "Her name," he said, "is spoken correctly in this hall, or it is not spoken." He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He said it the way he might state a navigational fact. "The road going north ends here," and went back to his cup. Aldrich corrected himself. The table continued. Mira stood with her hands still at her sides and kept her face where it needed to be, and she thought about the warmth that had moved through her hand at the treaty stone and wondered how many times she was going to have to stop herself from naming what it was before she ran out of alternative explanations. The poisoned goblet came on the 14th night, which was the night Voss made his formal presentation of the unified Eastern campaign, a ceremony requiring a toast from each table, the goblets poured by a single server who moved across the hall with a cart bearing the night's wine. Mira had been watching that server since the meal's second course, not because she was suspicious by nature, but because she noticed specific things: the way he poured, the angle of his wrist, the pause at the cart that was a half-beat too deliberate before he poured the goblet that went to the dais. She had stood in her mother's workroom as a girl and watched the same pause, the moment before the measure, the stillness of someone who is adding something that is not wine. The goblet reached Kale's place. He had not noticed. He was in conversation with Davin at his right, and his hand moved toward the cup with the absent familiarity of a man reaching for something that had always been safe. Mira was standing at his left. She thought about her mother's notes. She thought about the particular silence that had been her mother's kept knowledge, the healer's knowledge of what could be placed in a drink and what it would do to the body of a wolf, because her mother had treated wolves, had known their vulnerabilities, had written the word iron veil in a careful hand beside the notation on respiratory failure in wolves exposed to the compound in solution. She thought about 40 silver weights and what they had bought. She reached across and took the goblet and drank before she had finished deciding to. The taste was bitter in a way that was not the wine, and she recognized it. She set the cup down. She kept her face still. She heard Kale go entirely quiet beside her, a quality of stillness different from his usual kind, and she thought, with a clarity that she suspected was the compound beginning to work, that she should probably tell Senna about the yarrow, because she was going to need the full bundle. Her knees did not give immediately. She had time to set the goblet down precisely, to turn away from the table as if she were simply stepping back, and to reach the narrow alcove behind the dais's left column before the compound finished announcing itself. She heard the hall behind her, and she heard her own breathing, and she heard, closer than she had expected, Cale's voice saying her name in a way that was not a question and was not a command and was not anything she had previously heard from him. The next part she remembered in pieces. He carried her to the small chamber off the hall's far corridor. She knew this because she woke there, and because the stone floor showed no drag marks, which meant she had not walked. Senna was already present, with the yarrow oil and a bowl of steaming water, and she was working with the focused efficiency of someone who has been waiting for a specific emergency. Cale was standing at the room's single window with his back to both of them, and the set of his shoulders was a thing Mira had not seen in him before. A particular kind of tension that was not readiness for action, but something closer to the effort of not doing something. Davin was at the door. He said, to no one in particular, "The server is in the lower cells. Voss's man. He will not leave them." Cale did not turn from the window. "The compound," Mira said, because her voice was working and someone should clarify. "Iron veil, in solution. It acts on the lungs. Less acute in a human body than in a wolf. I knew that." She paused. "I was fairly sure of that." Senna made a sound that was not quite words. Cale turned from the window. His face had nothing of the hall's careful stillness in it, and she looked at him for the first time without either of them performing for an audience, and something in the look she had been avoiding naming from the beginning of this 14-day proximity was suddenly harder to avoid. "You drank it knowing," he said. It was not a question. "You were reaching for the cup," she said. He looked at her for a long time in the way of a man who has been given something he did not ask for and does not know what to do with. And then he looked away. "If you are still with this story, stay close to the next part. The worst of it is coming. And it matters where you are standing when it arrives." 3 days after the poisoned goblet, Lord Voss arrived at the keep's great hall for the formal mid-campaign council, his delegation filling the left table again under their eastern banners, and he came with something new in his posture. Mira saw it when she entered on Cale's left, that particular angle of readiness in a man who is about to use the thing he has been saving. She sat. Cale sat. The council scribe opened the session. Voss stood before the first item was reached. "I bring a matter of treaty standing," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has been practicing the exact sentence. "The Iron Accord's 7th clause requires that a king holding sovereign land during declared war must govern alongside a recognized consort of legitimate standing. Legitimate standing is defined within the clause as a free woman of documented lineage, not a debt-bound tribute contracted for compensation." The hall was very quiet. "The woman presented as this king's consort," Voss continued, "was purchased for 40 silver weights from a tribute broker named Korath of the Northern Reaches, on a service contract that names her a paid proxy. She is not a consort. She is a purchased pretense. The treaty clause is in violation, and by the accord's own terms, that violation renders the king's sovereign claim forfeit until the assembly judges the matter and restores it, if it finds cause." He sat down. Mira kept her hand still on the table's surface. She felt the hall look at her. She felt the weight of 40 silver weights in a room with 100 witnesses, and she sat with her chin at the angle Senna had taught her, and she did not perform a self she did not have, and she did not speak. Davin was on his feet. "The Assembly cannot receive this motion without the Council's presiding vote. The Council has 3 members senior to this table, and 2 of them are not present in this hall. By the Accord's own procedure, the motion requires a full quorum." Voss smiled. The presiding war council is defined during declared war as the assembly of all witnessing alphas and their acknowledged seconds. Every man in this room qualifies. The quorum sits now. He looked around the hall. And the assembly has heard what the tribute girl is. He looked at Mira when he said it. He let it land. Kale was very still beside her. Mira looked at Voss. She had nothing to say to him that would change anything in this hall, because the thing he had named was true, and she had never been in the business of denying true things to buy herself comfort. She had been purchased for 40 silver weights. She had arrived in a covered cart. She had presented as a queen for 14 days in a keep that needed the appearance of one, and she had learned the corridors and the court, and she had drunk from a poisoned cup, and none of that changed what the ledger said. She sat very still and waited for what would come. What came was Kale's voice. "The motion is received," he said. "I will answer it." He stood. "The 7th clause names legitimate standing as a condition of treaty compliance," he said. "Voss intends it as a trap. He is not wrong that the woman beside me was brought here under a debt contract. He is wrong about what that proves." He paused, and the pause held the whole hall. The Iron Accord's legitimacy clause contains one exception. A blood bond freely given supersedes all prior contract status. It requires 2 willing parties and a witness declaration before the full assembly. He looked at Mira. "I will not ask her in private, because I have not earned the right to ask her where no one can see the answer." The hall was a single held breath. "Mira Ashvale," he said, her full name in the formal mode. She heard it as the hinge it was. "You are not bound to agree. If you say no, the violation holds, the treaty falls, and I answer it without you. That is the truth of the choice." She thought about 40 silver weights. She thought about her mother's workroom and the folded notes in her bundle upstairs. She thought about a hand on a cold stone that had not let go for one breath longer than the ceremony required. She thought about a man at a window who had not been able to turn away from it, not because the view is anything, but because turning back would have shown his face to a room, and his face at that moment had not been the face of a king. She thought about the warmth, which she had run out of alternative explanations for. She stood. "I am willing," she said. 2 words. She did not elaborate, because the truth she had was exactly that size. Something shifted in Kale's face that she did not try to name yet. He reached to his belt and drew a short ceremonial blade, the kind carried only for compact rites, and he drew it across his own palm. He held his hand open before the assembly, the blood crossing his lifeline in a clean mark. "I yield this bond freely," he said, "before this assembly and under no treaty compulsion. What she is not by ledger. What I give without condition." Mira held out her hand. He drew the blade across her palm, a clean sting in the cold hall air, and pressed his hand to hers, blood to blood, before the whole watching assembly. The bond did not arrive quietly. The light came from their joined hands, rising through the skin in threads that were neither gold nor silver, but something between. A color that had no name in the hall's torchlight, and it ran from their palms up their arms, and the air in the hall changed temperature, and the iron veil residue still tracing Mira's bloodstream reacted to it the way her mother's notes said it would, burning out clean, the compound consumed in the bond's warmth, and she felt it leave her body in one long exhale that she had not known she was holding. Across the left table, Voss had risen. He was speaking in a loud voice about procedural violation, about the blade being unregistered, about the blood bond's validity requiring documentation. His voice was gaining altitude in the hall, growing louder as the hall itself grew quieter, which was the specific desperation of a man watching the weapon he had spent weeks carrying fail to fire. Davin walked to the left table. He did not draw a weapon. He stood in front of Voss and said, in a voice that was quiet enough that most of the hall had to lean to catch it, The server in the cells has given us your seal on the instruction. The compound was procured from your supply stores. You brought a poisoner into this king's hall. The assembly has heard it from his own mouth. He looked at the other Eastern alphas along the table. Your witnesses were in this hall when it was confirmed. The Accord's 31st clause covers acts of poisoning within a sovereign's walls during treaty negotiation. You know what it carries. Voss looked at the table. He looked at the alphas beside him, who had drawn incrementally away from him in the small, deliberate way of men who have decided something quietly. He looked at Kale. Kale had not moved from the dais. He was still holding Mira's hand, the joined light fading now to a faint warmth at the contact point. And he looked at Voss across the hall with a patience that was more final than any anger. "Strip his pack rank," Kale said. "He answers the Accord's clause before the full council tomorrow. He leaves the Ashfang territories by week's end. If he is found within them after that, the sentence the clause provides is not commuted." Voss made one more sound, a word that was half a protest and half something older, something desperate in the way of a man who has organized his life around the certainty of his own safety. The sound did not finish. Two of the Ashfang guards had reached the left table, and Voss's voice ended when he understood from their positions that there was no remaining move to make. Davin was watching Mira. She met his gaze across the hall's length. He looked at her for a moment in the assessing way she had grown familiar with across 14 days. And then he did something she had not seen from him in all that time. He lowered his chin, a precise angle, the same angle Senna had taught her on her first morning. He went to one knee on the stone floor of the hall, the foreign alpha on the right table, a woman from the Western Mountain Territory who had not spoken in any prior session, rose from her chair and lowered herself in the same motion. The rest of the hall moved the way water moves when a barrier gives. First one, then several, then all of them, the assembled alphas and their seconds and the War Council's members and the court officials along the walls, going to their knees in the firelit hall with the winter pressing at the high windows and the night of sealed fires burning outside in the courtyard's torches. Mira stood on the dais and held Kale's hand, the cut on her palm still warm, and she looked out at the kneeling hall, and she did not perform awe, because what she felt was not awe. It was something simpler and more interior, the sensation of a door that had been pressed shut for a very long time opening from the other side. Kale turned to her. He was looking at her in the way he had looked at her from the window in the recovery room, with nothing of the hall in his face, just his face. And the question in it was not about the treaty or the compact or what the assembly would record. "Are you in pain?" he said. She considered the cut, the residue of iron veil leaving her blood, the 14 days of performance and compressed steadiness. "Less than I was," she said, which was exactly true. Something in him settled, a tension she had not seen him carry because he had never not been carrying it, and his grip on her hand shifted from the formal position of the blood bond right to something else, a simple hold. His fingers loose and warm around hers in the hall where 100 people knelt. The weeks that followed shaped themselves around a different kind of proximity. The War Council met 3 more times before the campaign's formal winter close, and Mira sat at the dais for all of them in a role that no longer required the pretense of legitimacy, because the pretense had been replaced. Senna continued to arrive each morning with the yarrow replenished and with the day's information, and she continued to deliver both in the same practical tone she used for gown pins. And she began, without announcing the change, to address Mira as my queen rather than by her given name. And she said it in the plain way she said everything, as if the word were simply the correct one. Davin's skepticism did not dissolve entirely, which Mira found she did not mind. He was skeptical in the way of a man who has been wrong before about what he could afford to trust, and that kind of skepticism was not contempt. It was caution applied to something that mattered to him. He came to her 3 days after the hall's events with a question about the northern supply lines, a logistical matter involving a bridge crossing and the timing of the winter thaw. And he asked her because she had grown up in the northern reaches and knew the river's seasonal behavior. Not because she was the queen, but because she was the person who had the information. She gave it to him. He listened. He said, "That fits what the scouts reported," in a tone that conceded the point without making a ceremony of the concession. After that, he began consulting her on 2 or 3 matters per week in the same way. She did not hold it over him. She answered what she knew and said plainly when she did not know, and he asked fewer preliminary questions each time. Kale came to her chamber on the 5th evening after the hall, in the late hour when the keep had gone quiet, and he knocked rather than arriving as the king who held every room by right of standing. She opened the door. He was carrying a small iron cup of something that smelled of bitter herbs and winter bark, which she recognized as a sovereign sleep remedy, the kind a healer would make for a person whose mind was not releasing the day's weight. He held the cup out to her. "Senna's recipe," he said. "She told me you had not slept past the second bell since the hall." Mira looked at the cup. She looked at him. She thought about asking how long Senna had been reporting her sleeping patterns to the king, and then she decided the answer was obvious and the question was unnecessary. "You made it yourself," she said. It was not a question. She could see the herb staining on his right hand's first 2 fingers. "I did not want to bring someone else into the corridor at this hour," he said, which was true, and was also not the whole truth, and they both understood the part he had left out. She took the cup. She stepped back from the door to let him in, and he came in and stood in her chamber with the single hearth fire behind him, and looked at the room in the way of a man who has been in a place before in his mind many times, and is now calibrating the real space against the imagined one. "The 40 weights," he said after a time, "are not something you need to address," she said. "I am going to address them," he said, with the matter-of-fact firmness that she had learned meant the matter was decided in his mind, and the conversation's remaining work was informational. "Korath's contract is voided by the bond rights terms. The debt it secured is discharged. You are not a tribute. You have not been one since the hall. I want you to hear it said plainly and not from a scribe." She held the iron cup in both hands and felt its warmth against her palms. "You could have said it through Davin," she said. "Yes," he said. The words sat between them for a moment. "I wanted to say it to you," he said. She drank the remedy, which tasted of bark and something sweeter underneath it, and she thought about warmth and doors and the specific weight of a debt that had shaped the last month of her life. And she thought about how a thing could stop being true, not through argument, but through being replaced by a different and larger truth. The way a small fire is not extinguished by a bigger one, but simply made invisible in its light. She did not say any of that. She said, "Thank you for making it." He said, "Sleep past the second bell." He left. She did. The Iron Accord's winter campaign closed formally on the 41st day of her time in the keep, which fell 3 days after the winter solstice, in a gray morning assembly that was less ceremonial than the first and more final. The foreign delegations departed one by one through the main gate, their banners rolled and their carts loaded, the mason-jawed Alpha from the left table going out without looking at the dais, and Voss's Eastern delegation going out 2 hours before that. Stripped of their lead banner per the Accords clause, Voss himself reduced in the column to a middle position that announced his diminished standing to anyone who knew how to read the order. Mira stood at the gate with Kyle and watched them go, and she had nothing to feel about Voss except a clean finality, the sensation of a chapter whose ending had been written in the right ink. Davin came to her at midday with the dispatch from the Northern Line, which had held through the winter campaign, and he told her he was riding out to take command of the garrison there for the spring assessment. He said it to her directly, not to Kale across the room, and he waited. "The bridge I told you about," she said. "The eastern approach will flood by the first thaw. Take the high road around the ridge. It adds a day, but you will have the advantage of the elevation at the garrison's north-facing approach." He nodded. He started to go. "Davin," she said. He stopped. "The northern garrison is 3 days' ride in this cold," she said. "Take the good cloaks from the supply room. There are 4 of them. Your men will use them." He looked at her for a moment with the assessment still in him, but differently now. The way a man looks at a landmark he has been using for reference long enough to have stopped noticing he depends on it. "Yes, my queen," he said, and rode out under a white sky with the good cloaks folded behind his saddle. The keep was quieter after the delegations cleared. The War Council remained for the post-campaign assessments, but the foreign pressure was gone from the corridors, and the hall felt larger in its absence. Senna moved through the chambers in her efficient way, noting what needed mending and what could be released. And she came to Mira one evening with a small square of iron-set resin seal, the Queen's official mark, pressed onto a cord. "It came from the council steward this morning," she said. She pinned it at Mira's collar in the brisk way she pinned everything, as if it were a matter of correct positioning rather than weight. She stepped back and looked. "It was made for your collar width," Mira said, because the fit was exact, and the seal was not a repurposed piece. "Yes," Senna said. Mira looked at her. Senna's face stayed where it was. "The steward requires measurements," she said. "I provided them some time ago. Shall I bring the morning yarrow, or would you prefer the bark remedy again tonight?" Mira chose the yarrow because she was sleeping better now, and because the bark remedy tasted of something she was not yet ready to acknowledge she had grown fond of. On the last evening of the formal winter council, Kale found her in the small study off the eastern corridor, where she had been reading the Accord's historical notes from the keep's record shelf, not because she needed them, but because reading the long record of the thing that had purchased her gave her a specific satisfaction. The satisfaction of knowing the machinery's exact specifications now that she was no longer inside it, unknowing. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked up, and they looked at each other in the quiet room, with the hearth making its low sound. "The council closes its winter term tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. He moved to the chair across the study table and sat down, which was the first time she had seen him choose a chair in a room rather than a standing position at its edge, and the small fact of it settled into the room's warmth. "You can go," he said. "If you want to go. The bond's legal effect does not require your continued presence, and the treaty needs nothing further. You are not held here." She set down the record she had been reading. She thought about a covered cart and 2 cloaks, and a mother's folded notes. She thought about a chamber where the yarrow had been on the table before she arrived, because someone had taken the trouble to learn what she used before she came. She thought about 40 silver weights, which were now ash, and about what it was that replaced a thing when you named it out loud in a hall before 100 witnesses. "I know I am not held," she said. He waited. "I would like to stay," she said. The words were simple, and she said them simply, without architecture, because they were true in exactly that size. The fire made it sound. He reached across the table and set his hand open on its surface, palm up, the old cut at the lifeline still pink in the firelight, the same hand he had held out over the treaty stone on the first morning, and she set her hand into it the way she had then, but differently now, in the full knowledge of what the warmth was. She felt it move from the contact point up through her wrist and settle below her collarbone where it had always been waiting, and this time she did not reach for an alternative explanation. She did not need one. In the morning, Senna arrived as always, with the yarrow and with the cord still pinned at Mira's collar from the night before, which she adjusted by 1 precise degree, without comment. Below in the courtyard, the council's last carts were moving out through the gate under a pale winter sky, and the keep's bells were ringing the hour in their cold tower. And the throne room was quiet and full of firelight, and in it, on the stone floor where the assembly had knelt and the false treaty's smoke had long since cleared, Kel stood at the window with his back to the room. When she came in, he turned. His hand was open at his side. She crossed the room. She put her hand in his, in the room where it had all begun, and the 40-weight debt was ash, and the treaty was dissolved, and the circlet of hammered iron was at her temples and behind her. In the doorway where Senna stood with her hands folded and her face giving nothing away, the keep was beginning its mourning in the plain, ordinary way of a place that had settled into what it now was. Cale's scarred hand was warm around hers. Outside, the first pale light of a winter thaw was just reaching the frozen courtyard, and the torches along the keep's walls were burning steady in the still air.